The Norfolk Naval Station sprawled across the Virginia coastline like a small city, but for Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, it felt like a prison. After 14 years of service, 2 deployments, and more late nights than she could count, she still couldn't walk into a room without someone's eyes lingering a second too long, not with respect, but with doubt. It was a Monday morning in September when everything changed. Sarah stood in the maintenance bay of the USS Eisenhower, the massive aircraft carrier that had been her second home for the past 3 years. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck, and the smell of salt water mixed with jet fuel filled the air. She was reviewing the startup sequence for the ship's main systems with her team when Captain Henderson walked in with 2 younger officers and a civilian man in his 70s. The old man moved slowly, his weathered face creased with deep lines, his white hair thin but neatly combed. He wore a visitor's badge and a faded Navy jacket from decades past. Captain Henderson's voice boomed across the bay before he even reached them. "Sarah, I want you to meet Herbert Rollins. He served on the Eisenhower back in 1989, worked in engineering. He's in town visiting his daughter and wanted to see his old ship." Sarah extended her hand. "Welcome back, sir. It's an honor to meet a veteran of this vessel." Herbert's grip was firm, but his eyes held something she couldn't quite read. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was something else. "Things a lot different than I remember," he said, looking around the bay. He turned back to Sarah. "You the one running this show now?" "I oversee maintenance operations for the main systems, yes, sir," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. One of the younger officers, Lieutenant Dalton, laughed quietly. The sound made Sarah's jaw tighten. She'd heard that laugh before, usually right after someone made a comment about her being in a man's job or questioned whether she'd gotten her position through merit or politics. "With all due respect, sir," Captain Henderson said, turning to Herbert with an apologetic smile. "Times have changed. We have women in every role now, though I'll admit some of the old-timers have trouble adjusting." Herbert nodded slowly, a knowing smirk crossing his face. "I'm sure they do fine enough," he said, in a tone that made it clear he didn't believe that at all. "Still, this ship's got a temperamental engine system, always did, needs a real touch." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt her chest tighten, that familiar burn of anger mixed with resignation. She'd heard variations of this her entire career. "The USS Eisenhower systems are state-of-the-art, Mr. Rollins," she said calmly. "I can show you the upgrades we've made since your time here." Herbert waved his hand dismissively. "I'm sure it's all very impressive, but I'm betting the ship wouldn't even start up under your command. These carrier systems need someone with real experience, someone who understands them at a deeper level." Captain Henderson shifted uncomfortably. The 2 younger officers exchanged glances. "That's quite a statement," Sarah said quietly. She could feel her hands trembling slightly with anger, but she kept her voice level. "We run full diagnostics and maintenance cycles regularly. The Eisenhower is in perfect operational condition." "Is she, though?" Herbert stepped closer, his eyes challenging. "Or are you just going through the motions? See, back in my day, you had to really know a ship, had to have a feel for her. Can't teach that to just anyone." The implication was clear, and it landed like a punch. Lieutenant Dalton didn't even try to hide his smirk this time. Sarah took a breath. She'd faced worse than this. She'd faced it from commanding officers, from crew members, from her own family members who'd questioned why she'd enlisted in the first place. She'd learned not to fight back immediately, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. "I understand your perspective, sir," she said, choosing each word carefully. "You served with honor and that's respected, but things have evolved. The Navy evolves." Herbert's eyes narrowed. "Prove it, start her up, right now. Show me this ship can run under your command." Captain Henderson stepped forward. "That's not necessary, Mr. Rollins. The Eisenhower is fully operational." "I'm not asking you," Herbert interrupted, keeping his eyes on Sarah. "I'm asking her, or is the lieutenant commander going to hide behind her captain?" There it was, the trap. If Sarah refused, she'd look like she couldn't handle the challenge. If she accepted, she'd be gambling the ship's systems on the whim of an old man with hurt feelings about change. But there was a third option, one she'd learned from years of navigating these situations. "The startup sequence takes time," Sarah said. "Equipment this complex doesn't respond to showboating, but if you'd like to observe a standard operational check of our main systems, I'd be happy to walk you through the process." It was a perfect answer, professional, confident, immovable. But Herbert smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. Sounds like a no to me. Sounds like someone who isn't sure her ship will listen to her. As Herbert left the bay with Captain Henderson, who kept apologizing profusely, Sarah stood alone in the morning light. Lieutenant Dalton paused on his way out. "Don't let him get to you," he said, but there was no warmth in his voice. "Everyone knows the real work is still done by the old guard. You're just filling a space." Sarah waited until she was completely alone before she let her hands stop shaking. She walked over to the massive control panel and placed her palm on the cool metal. The USS Eisenhower hummed beneath her fingers, responsive, alive, ready to obey her commands. But words like his had a way of planting seeds. Seeds of doubt. Seeds that grew in the darkness of night when she couldn't sleep. Seeds that whispered, "What if they're right? What if you don't belong here?" She didn't know yet that Herbert Rowlands would become her greatest challenge, and eventually, the reason for her greatest vindication. She didn't know that his doubt would push her toward truth that had been hidden for years. All Sarah knew in that moment was that she had a job to do, a ship to maintain, and a fire in her chest that wouldn't go out. 3 days passed, and Sarah tried her best to move forward. The encounter with Herbert Rowlands had left a mark, though, the kind of mark that doesn't show on your skin but shows up in your posture, in the way you hold yourself a little tighter, speak a little more carefully. The maintenance team had noticed the shift. Sarah's crew of 12 was solid, mostly experienced technicians who'd worked with her for years and understood that she ran a tight ship. They knew her standards were high because she demanded the same from herself. But word travels fast in a military vessel, and by the time Sarah came in for her Wednesday morning briefing, everyone had heard about the old man's challenge. "Don't worry about it, ma'am," Petty Officer First Class Marcus Chen said as they reviewed the weekly maintenance schedule. Marcus had been with her since she'd taken over operations 3 years ago. He was one of the few people on the ship she truly trusted. "Guys like that are all talk. Change threatens them." "It's not about worry," Sarah said, though she was lying a little. "It's about doing our job right. We always do our job right." But something had shifted inside her. Over the next week, Sarah found herself working longer hours. She began conducting additional diagnostic checks that weren't scheduled. She'd wake up at 3 in the morning, her mind spinning with technical specifications, running through scenarios in her head. Her assistant, Ensign Katie Williams, was only 23, fresh out of the academy, and had been assigned to Sarah's division just 6 months earlier. On Friday afternoon, Katie found Sarah in the control room, running diagnostics alone, a cold cup of coffee sitting untouched beside her. "Ma'am, you've been here since 5 this morning. Don't you need to rest?" Sarah didn't look away from the monitors, just making sure everything's running optimally. "Everything is running optimally," Katie said gently. "You checked it yesterday and the day before." Sarah finally turned to face the young woman. Katie's expression was open, concerned. She had kind eyes and the kind of confidence that only came from not yet having been beaten down by systemic doubt. "You know what it's like?" Sarah asked quietly. "To have people question every single thing you do, not your mistakes, everything, not because you've failed, but because of who you are." Katie was quiet for a moment. "No, ma'am, I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Sarah said. "Just listen, this job, this career, it's taken everything from me. My marriage, time with my family, a normal life. I gave it all because I believed in serving something bigger than myself. I believed I was good at this, that I had something to contribute." She gestured at the vast array of monitors and controls around them. "And people like Herbert Rowlands look at me and see someone who doesn't deserve to be here. Someone who's in the way of real work. Someone who got lucky or got a position because the Navy needed to fill quotas." "That's not true, ma'am," Katie said firmly. "Everyone on this ship knows you're the best we have." Sarah managed a small smile. "Thank you for that, but maybe I should prove it to someone who matters." That weekend, Sarah drove home to her apartment in Norfolk. It was a modest one-bedroom place that she'd lived in alone since her divorce 6 years ago. The walls were mostly bare. She hadn't bothered decorating because she didn't spend much time there. She had photos of her naval career, a few books, and not much else. She pulled out her personal computer and started digging. Not just the standard operational records, those were impeccable and she knew it. She went deeper into maintenance logs, historical files, repair records, systems architecture documentation. She wanted to understand every inch of the USS Eisenhower, not just as a functioning vessel, but as a complex organism with a history. Hours disappeared into the work. By Sunday night, Sarah had discovered something odd. The main engine startup sequence had been modified twice in recent years. The first modification was standard, a technological upgrade. But the second one, made just 18 months ago, didn't quite match the official documentation. The power distribution settings had been adjusted in a way that seemed inefficient. It wasn't wrong exactly, but it was strange. Sarah pulled up the name of the technician who'd made the modification. Senior Chief Engineering Officer James Walker. Walker had been with the Navy for 35 years. He was retired now, but had been a fixture in the engineering department until just over a year ago, right around the time the modification had been made. A thought began to form in Sarah's mind, but it was too big, too serious to voice out loud yet. She closed her laptop and sat in the darkness of her apartment, feeling the weight of something much heavier than doubt settling onto her shoulders. The next morning, she requested the maintenance records for the past 2 years under the guise of routine inventory. They were waiting for her by noon. She spent her lunch break in her office going through them carefully, her heart beating faster with each page. When she found it, she had to read it 3 times to be sure. There, in the maintenance logs from 14 months ago, an entry made by Senior Chief Walker, a notation that seemed innocuous on its surface. Adjusted primary startup sequence per new specifications, all systems verified. But attached to it, buried deep, easy to miss, was a handwritten addendum that Walker had apparently never uploaded to the official system. Modified output to avoid resonance cascade. Temporary fix pending full review. Temporary fix, pending review. No follow-up, no completion of review, no correction of the temporary measure. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She pulled up the current system specifications again and compared them to what the startup sequence should have been. The modified settings would work, they did work, but they were inefficient, and more importantly, they masked something. She needed to talk to someone outside the immediate chain of command, someone who would understand what she'd found and why it mattered. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone, but before she could dial, her office door opened without a knock. Captain Henderson stood in the doorway, his expression strange, something between guilt and concern. Captain Henderson closed the door carefully behind him and sat down in the chair across from Sarah's desk. His uniform was immaculate as always, but his face told a different story. He looked tired. More than tired, he looked burdened. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly," he said. "Have you noticed anything unusual about the Eisenhower's main engine systems?" Sarah's fingers went cold. This was not a coincidence. "Why are you asking?" she said carefully. Henderson ran his hand over his face. "Because that old man, Herbert Rowlands, he didn't come here randomly, and his comments about the ship, they weren't just the opinion of someone unsettled by change." Sarah waited. She'd learned years ago that silence was often more powerful than questions. "Herbert was chief engineer of this ship back in 1989, Henderson continued. "He remembered every inch of her. When he came aboard, he noticed something that shouldn't be there. He brought it to me Friday night after he left the maintenance bay. At first, I didn't believe him, but then I pulled the records." The captain leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "Sarah, there's a problem with the main startup sequence. A problem that was introduced by Senior Chief James Walker about 14 months ago. A problem that was never properly corrected." Sarah's heart began to pound. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that could cause a catastrophic failure during startup under certain conditions," Henderson said quietly. "Not under normal circumstances, that's why it's been missed. But if the resonance cascade happens at exactly the wrong moment, if the power distribution surges at the wrong interval, we're talking about potential structural damage to the core engine systems. Damage that could incapacitate this entire vessel." The words hung between them like a threat. "Why hasn't this been reported?" Sarah asked, her voice steady even as her mind spun. "Because," Henderson said heavily, "Senior Chief Walker is retiring with full honors next month. His pension, his benefits, his reputation, all locked in. And because the person who would have noticed this, who should have caught it during routine maintenance and system reviews," he paused, his eyes meeting hers. "That person wasn't here. The position was vacant for 6 months after your predecessor left. You only arrived when the problem was already hidden. Sarah felt something crystallize inside her. All those extra hours, all that doubt she'd been carrying, it had never been about her incompetence. It had been about something she couldn't have even seen. "What does Walker say about this?" she asked. "I haven't confronted him directly yet," Henderson admitted. "I wanted to verify the information first. But Sarah, here's the problem. If this becomes public, if a major safety issue is revealed that's been sitting on this ship for 14 months under my command, my career ends. The Navy launches an investigation, there are congressional hearings, and a lot of people go down." Sarah stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the massive hull of the USS Eisenhower gleaming in the afternoon sun. Thousands of people worked on this vessel. Thousands of lives depended on her systems working correctly. "We have to report it," she said quietly. "To Admiral Sinclair, to the Naval Safety Board, we have to report it officially and completely." "I know," Henderson said. "I know we do, but I wanted you to understand the stakes first. When this comes out, there will be scrutiny, hard questions, about how this was allowed to happen, about why maintenance operations didn't catch it." He didn't say it directly, but Sarah heard the implication clearly. Her department would be blamed. As the head of maintenance operations, the responsibility would fall on her, even though she'd been in the position for less than 3 years, even though the problem predated her arrival. "Then we'll face that scrutiny," Sarah said, turning back to him. "Because it's the right thing to do, because the safety of this ship matters more than anyone's career, including mine." Henderson nodded slowly, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. Respect, maybe, or relief, or perhaps both. "I'll arrange a meeting with Admiral Sinclair," he said. "We'll do this officially and completely. No shortcuts, no cover-ups." By Tuesday morning, Sarah found herself sitting in the office of Admiral Patricia Sinclair, one of the highest-ranking women in the Navy and someone Sarah had always admired from a distance. The Admiral was in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of presence that made everyone in the room sit a little straighter. Present were Captain Henderson, a representative from Naval Safety, and an official investigator. Sarah had brought physical copies of the maintenance records and her analysis of the system modifications. The Admiral reviewed the documentation carefully, her expression growing darker with each page. When she finally looked up, her eyes went directly to Sarah. "This notation here, the handwritten addendum from Senior Chief Walker, when did you discover it?" the Admiral asked. "Monday afternoon, ma'am," Sarah replied, "during routine maintenance record review." "And you immediately reported it to Captain Henderson?" "Actually, Captain Henderson came to me first," Sarah said, glancing at her commanding officer. "I had just been beginning my own investigation into the system anomalies when he brought the issue to my attention. It was the truth, but only partially. She didn't mention the sleepless nights, the self-doubt, the desperate need to prove something to an old man whose opinion shouldn't have mattered. Those details weren't relevant to the investigation." Admiral Sinclair set down the papers and folded her hands. "Do you understand what you've uncovered here, Lieutenant Commander?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. "A serious safety issue that has been masked by a faulty modification that was never properly documented or corrected." "And do you understand what comes next?" "An investigation, probably disciplinary action against Senior Chief Walker, a comprehensive review of all systems to ensure nothing else has been compromised." The Admiral nodded slowly. "What I'm asking, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, do you understand what this will cost you?" Sarah met her gaze. "Ma'am." "Once this investigation becomes official, once it goes through the proper channels, it becomes public record. It becomes part of the naval record. Senior Chief Walker has friends, people who have worked with him for decades, people who will protect their own. And you, Lieutenant Commander, you will be seen as the person who brought him down, whether that's fair or not." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I understand, ma'am." "Do you?" the Admiral asked gently. "Because I'm not sure you do. There will be people who question your motives, people who suggest that you were trying to advance your career by undermining a senior officer, people who claim that you overreported a minor discrepancy, and those whispers, regardless of their truth, will follow you." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. "I understand that now." Admiral Sinclair stood and walked to the window of her office, looking out at the same vista of the harbor that Sarah had looked at so many times. In my 35 years in the Navy, I've learned that doing the right thing and doing it for the right reasons are not always enough, but they're necessary. They're always necessary. She turned back to Sarah. You could have let this go. Your predecessor's failure to catch this, your captain's burden to carry, you could have reported it quietly through channels where it might have been buried or minimized. You didn't. You did the hard thing, the honest thing. The investigation took 3 months. 3 months of interviews, depositions, technical reviews, and bureaucratic chaos. 3 months during which Sarah's life became a series of depositions and explanations and careful explanations of technical details to people who weren't always qualified to understand them. Senior Chief James Walker fought back hard. He claimed the modification was temporary and had been made with proper authorization. He produced documents, some legitimate, some questionable, that suggested he'd been planning to complete the repair before his retirement. He had supporters. Officers who'd worked with him for 30 years testified to his character, his dedication, his expertise. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. In quiet conversations that eventually found their way back to Sarah, people began suggesting that Walker had indeed made an error, but that it was a minor one, an oversight that wouldn't have caused serious problems. The implication became that Sarah had overblown the issue, had been overly cautious, had perhaps been motivated by ambition rather than genuine concern. Lieutenant Dalton didn't hide his opinion, neither did several of the other officers. Sarah would overhear comments in the hallway, career climbing, can't let anyone else have success, threw a good man under the bus. Ensign Katie Williams remained loyal, but even she seemed uncertain some days, as though the weight of the gossip was starting to affect her confidence in her commanding officer. The hardest part wasn't the official investigation. That was clear-cut and damning. The hardest part was watching her reputation, her credibility, the respect she'd earned over 14 years, begin to crumble under the weight of whispered doubts. Sarah found herself eating alone in the officers' mess. She'd arrive at meetings and watch conversations stop mid-sentence. She'd walk through the maintenance bay and sense the shift in mood, the way people became less open with her, less willing to share ideas. By month 2 of the investigation, Sarah was seriously considering requesting a transfer. Maybe a shore posting, maybe even leaving the Navy. She'd given it everything, and now she was being punished for doing the right thing. It was during this dark period that Herbert Rowlands came to see her. She was alone in her office when her assistant buzzed to say she had a visitor. Her heart sank. She was not in the mood for civilian drama. But when Herbert walked in, something about him seemed different. He moved slower, as though the weight of something was pressing down on him. He looked older than he had in September. I won't take much of your time, he said without preamble. I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. Sarah blinked. Excuse me, sir. Herbert sat down without being invited. That day I came aboard, that thing I said about you not being capable of running this ship, I was wrong. I was bitter about the way things have changed, and I took it out on you. And then I found out that you were actually better at your job than the person I was protecting. Sarah said nothing. She wasn't sure what was happening. James Walker was my best friend, Herbert continued. Served with him for 15 years. When I came back here and realized what he'd done, what he'd been hiding, I had to decide whether I was a good man or just a loyal one. I chose to do the right thing, and I've had to watch that man's career implode. You did what you had to do, Sarah said carefully. I did, Herbert agreed. But I wanted you to understand something. The way people have been treating you these past few months, that anger they're directing at you, some of it is misdirected at me. I'm the one who brought this to Captain Henderson, but I'm an old man. I'm retired. People protect the institution over individuals, and James Walker is part of the institution in a way you're not. He leaned forward. So they're making you the villain, and that's not fair, but it's not new either, is it? You've been dealing with people assuming the worst about you since the day you put on that uniform. Sarah felt something break open inside her. The validation shouldn't have mattered. She knew she'd done the right thing. But hearing it from someone who'd initially doubted her, hearing it from the person who'd triggered all of this, somehow made it matter anyway. What happens now? She asked. Now, Herbert smiled sadly. Now you wait. The investigation concludes in a few weeks. The Navy will issue its findings. And then, depending on who's paying attention and who cares about the truth, the narrative will either hold or shift. He stood to leave and then paused at the door. You remind me of my granddaughter, he said. She's a lawyer, fights for things even when everyone's against her. I always told her that doing the right thing was its own reward. But watching what's happened to you, I'm starting to think that was just something I said to feel better about my own compromises." After he left, Sarah sat alone in her office as the sun set over the harbor. The press conference was held in the main auditorium at Norfolk Naval Station. It was larger than necessary, Sarah thought, though she understood why. The story had gotten out, not all of it, and not entirely accurately, but enough that the Navy had decided to address it officially and completely. Admiral Sinclair stood at a podium with Captain Henderson beside her, and Sarah sitting in the front row along with other key personnel. The Admiral's statement was precise and thorough. She detailed the modification made by Senior Chief James Walker, the hidden documentation, the safety risk that it presented. She commended Captain Henderson for bringing the matter to her attention. And then she turned to Sarah. "I want to take a moment to recognize Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell," the Admiral said, her voice steady and clear. "The maintenance officer who discovered the fundamental issues in our system records and brought them to her commanding officer's attention. She did so despite the personal cost to her reputation and her standing within the command." Sarah felt her throat tighten. It would have been easy for her to overlook this, to assume that the systems in place were adequate to protect her own position, Admiral Sinclair continued. Many officers would have made that choice. Instead, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell chose integrity. She chose the safety of this vessel and the lives aboard her over her own comfort. That is the definition of what we seek in Navy leadership. The Admiral paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried weight that seemed to fill the entire auditorium. "Effective immediately, I am recommending Lieutenant Commander Mitchell for promotion to Commander. I am also recommending her for the Naval Commendation Medal for her actions in uncovering this safety hazard. And I am personally requesting that she remain as Chief of Maintenance Operations for the USS Eisenhower, should she wish to continue in that role." Sarah couldn't breathe. She felt tears starting to form and forced them back, but just barely. As the press conference ended and officers began to disperse, something unexpected happened. The crew, the technicians, the mechanics, the people who Sarah worked with every single day began to gather in the auditorium. Dozens of them, then more. They stood together and slowly they began to applaud. It wasn't just polite applause, it was real. It was recognition. Ensign Katie Williams had tears running down her face. Marcus Chen was nodding, a clear expression of vindication on his face. Even some of the officers who doubted her appeared genuinely moved. As Sarah made her way out of the auditorium, people stopped her. They said things like, "We always knew, and thank you for standing up, and you made us proud." In the weeks that followed, the rest of the story emerged. Senior Chief Walker's retirement was canceled. He faced a court-martial for falsifying maintenance records and safety documentation. The investigation expanded to look at other systems throughout the fleet that he'd worked on, discovering 3 additional vessels with similar problems. What emerged was a pattern of a man who was capable and experienced, who'd been good at his job for a long time, but who'd cut corners as he aged and wanted to ease into retirement. It wasn't malicious, exactly. It was worse in some ways. It was negligence born of entitlement. The Navy used the case in training programs. Sarah was asked to speak at officer schools about integrity and difficult decisions. She declined most of the invitations, but she accepted one at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. She stood in front of 300 midshipmen, wearing her new commander's insignia, and she told them the truth. "When I was where you are," she said, "I believed that if I did my job well, if I worked hard and was competent and dedicated, that would be enough. That merit would be recognized, that I would be judged on my abilities." She paused, letting her eyes scan the crowd. "I was wrong. Merit matters, but it's not enough. How you look, who you are, what biases people bring to their interpretation of your work, those things matter too. And that's not fair. But fairness isn't promised in the military, just like it isn't promised in life. What is promised is the opportunity to choose integrity, to choose doing the right thing when it costs you something. And that choice, when you make it, when you actually make it and suffer the consequences of it, that's when you become the kind of officer this Navy needs. Not the kind who wins easily, the kind who wins doing it right." 3 months after her promotion, Sarah was summoned to Admiral Sinclair's office again. But this time, the tone was completely different. The Admiral was reviewing personnel files, and she looked up as Sarah entered. "How are you settling into the new position?" she asked. Well, ma'am, Sarah said, the crew has been supportive. We've begun a comprehensive audit of all system modifications made in the past 5 years to ensure there are no other hidden issues. Good, the Admiral nodded. I have something I wanted to talk to you about. We're commissioning a new vessel, the USS Sarah Mitchell, a guided missile destroyer. We're looking for a commanding officer to oversee her transition into active duty. Sarah's heart stopped, a captain's position, command of her own ship. I'd be honored, ma'am, she said, her voice steady. As she left the Admiral's office, walking through the corridors of the naval station she'd come to know so well, Sarah found herself thinking about that day in September, about the old man challenging her, about the doubt that had nearly broken her, about the choice she'd made to do the right thing even when it cost everything. She thought about Lieutenant Dalton, who'd been reassigned to shore duty after his connections to Walker had been revealed. She thought about Captain Henderson, whose command had been questioned but ultimately vindicated. She thought about Herbert Rowlands, who'd become an unlikely friend and who'd shown her that people could change, could choose integrity over loyalty to old bonds. But mostly she thought about the future, about the USS Sarah Mitchell and the crew she would command, about the young women and men who would serve under her and learn that integrity wasn't just a value, it was a practice. It was something you did every day in every decision, even when no one was watching and no one would know. The next evening, Sarah stood on the deck of the USS Eisenhower looking out at the Atlantic Ocean. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The ship hummed beneath her feet, responsive, alive, ready for whatever came next. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, Sarah heard it clearly, not with her ears but with something deeper. The sound of a mission accomplished. The sound of truth prevailing. The sound of a woman who'd refused to break, who'd chosen integrity over comfort, and who had been vindicated not by luck or sympathy, but by the undeniable power of doing the right thing. She placed her palm against the ship's railing, feeling the salt spray on her face, and smiled. The USS Sarah Mitchell was waiting for her. The Navy was waiting for her. And most importantly, Sarah Mitchell was finally done waiting for permission to claim her place. She had earned it, with courage, with sacrifice, with truth.